Hello, everyone. The hour's just ticked over, so why don't we begin now? My name's Chris Bayliss. I'm Director of Standards with Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. I'm delighted to be hosting another of these 45-minute on sessions, a chance for you, the membership, to see the kind of work that's going on within the Secretariat, within the ASI at large at the moment. This week, a really topical subject. We're doing 45 minutes on greenhouse gas emissions. And a review of a recent report developed for ASI by Atmolite Consulting. And we're very lucky today to be joined by David Wong, Nursiani, Tjahyono, and Ronny Etzion from Atmolite. Welcome, folks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
David, Nursiani, and Ronny have been working on this report, which is the second year that they've reported on transparency, on public disclosure, and some of the some of the mismatch between public disclosure and what's being asked for within the ASI standards. So we're going to explore some of that today. Our agenda for today will actually be led by David in the first part of this webinar. He'll present the results of the report, and then we're going to go into a discussion and Q&A where Nursiani and Ronny will also join us to answer some questions that you, the audience, have. And what we like to do in these sessions, and what we really want to do today, is to involve you. So if you have any questions of clarification, or broad questions about greenhouse gases within ASI's remit, then please do use the Q&A box. If the next slide, please, David, shows you how to do that. So there should be a box at the bottom. It's called a Q&A window. Open that up and ask your questions. You can ask throughout David's presentation, throughout the 45 minutes today, and then I'll manage that process as well. You can also use the chat, but you probably won't get listened to because I'm too busy focusing on the Q&A. So please do join in. Please do send your questions, and I'm sure Ronny and David and colleagues will also be happy to answer questions following this call as well, and you'll see our email addresses at the end. So with that, maybe I'll ask David to present the results of your report, Atmolite Consulting's report, and then we can take it from there. So please, David, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks everyone for dialing tonight, and those who are listening into the recording as well. So I'm David Wong from Atmolite Consulting. I'm joined by my colleagues Ronny, Etzion, and Nursiani Tjahyono. We're from Atmolite Consulting. And tonight, or this morning, wherever you are in the world, we'll just be giving a quick overview or a summary of the report and the work that we just completed earlier this year. And that's on analysing the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions by ASI's certified members. For this year, and it is an update of a previous one that we had conducted in 2020. So stay tuned, and right. So let's get started. What was the work done in this 2021 review? The objective was to assess, collect, and then assess the emissions and energy disclosures by ASI's certified entities. It is an update of a previous 2021 that we conducted then. So it's an update of changes since then, but it also encompasses all the new certifications at ASI up to, I think, the end of March 2021. Another of our tasks was to look at the energy and emissions profiles across the ASI cohort of entities and how that compared across different regions of the world and across the different individual supply chain activities within the aluminium industry, and also comment on any trends over time. One interesting new thing that we looked at this year was to compare the disclosures from individual entities to an independent data set from CRU, and we'll look at that later on in the presentation. And ultimately, this work was to provide some technical context and input into ASI's standards revision process, which is currently underway, and there are revisions to the ASI performance standard shown on the right here, as well as the chain of custody standard. So this is just a really quick summary of that report. If you'd like to go to the report itself, it's on the ASI website. Just look for outcome and impact evaluations and you can have a read of the report there. Right, let's get cracking. So the review that we conducted encompassed the entities that were certified up until the end of March of this year. That's 87 ASI entities, performance standard and chain of custody certifications. Of that, there's 55 member companies. So, within each member, there can be a number of entities as well. And of the 87 entities, that expanded to 115 different data entries, because some of those entities had data disclosures for different supply chain activities, alumina refining or smelting. In terms of how those entities distributed around the world, about half of them are in Europe and in the Gulf Cooperation Council region, 25% China, Asia, Oceania, 10% in North and South America, and the remainder 15% spread across their entities that are across multiple regions and countries. The entities that we reviewed are those spread across the supply chain. So we've got primary activities right from bauxite mining, alumina refining and smelting, as well as the secondary aluminium recycling activities as well, whereby post-consumer scrap is recycled and turned into products as well. So covering the full range of activities in the industry. Right, moving into disclosures, and the whole point of it was of this work was to collect and collate disclosed emissions and energy from ASI certified entities. So we looked at up to the last 5 years of data from each entity from a range of sources. So that includes websites, sustainability reports, life cycle analysis reports, annual reports, etc. Some of those entities disclosed also to the Carbon Disclosure Project. Some reported to local, national governmental bodies, and we took some of the data was from those as well. Where there was no disclosures found, we provide feedback to ASI and flagged that to them to chase up. And we'll look at a comparison of those disclosures with the independent CAU dataset later on. Right, now moving quickly into what we found in terms of quality of data disclosures. The slide here just is a quick summary of some of the major trends of what we found this year. So 3/4 of ASI's entities were disclosing a good level or a medium level quality of data disclosures, both energy and emissions, which is pretty good. Up to 98%, so almost all entities were providing some level of disclosures. There were a couple that didn't, and they were flagged to ASI. But overall, there were a proportion of entities, 28%, that didn't necessarily, that provided disclosures, but not necessarily directly correlated with their scope of certification under ASI. So that's an area of improvement going forward. Another sort of promising point that we found as we were going through these disclosures were that many of these new ASI entities being certified, some of those small enterprises, those in China and Europe, some of them were publicly disclosing sustainability and social performance for the very first time in their history of the company. So we thought that was a really positive trend to see, and probably in part due to going through that ASI certification process. Moving on, looking at are the quality of disclosures improving over time? Well, in terms of the 2 years that we've done this, and looking at just the cohort of entities that we looked at in 2020 and whether there were changes, in the current year, there does seem to be an improving trend. So 25% more entities were now disclosing good or medium levels of disclosure, and in total 87%. So this graph here just shows the green bars are the good and medium levels of disclosure and improvement for all entities, for entities in smelting and also entities in alumina refining. So what we need to see is these improvements sustained and continuing in the future. as part of the work that we've been doing the past couple of years in terms of reviewing disclosures, we've been able to support ASI in some of the oversight of specific disclosures, particularly where some of the data being disclosed might look a little bit odd compared to the industry benchmarks per se. So some examples here, there were examples whereby some entities, mistakenly disclosed an incorrect unit, and after providing some feedback to that entity through its auditors, that was corrected, and they were quite happy to be informed of that. There were other there was one other entity here where there were some errors suspected and made in terms of the emission disclosures they were making, and so after some feedback to the editor, again that was corrected, and there's some ongoing queries around just the consistency of approach that they're using in terms of the emission factors being taken. And as flagged before, a few entities with no disclosures, we've flagged that to ASI. And that's part of the process that we've been working on. We mentioned comparing, having a comparison of what entities are disclosing with an independent tool. So to do that, we used the CRU International Emissions and Analysis tool. They've just recently released that. There was I think a 45-minute ASI discussion on that a month ago or so. So go check that out. The links to that. But that tool provides asset level data for emissions and energy use. So it was a really interesting exercise comparing the entity disclosures with that independent analysis tool. The graph here on the left is just one example of comparing emissions, scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions per tonne of product for the ASI smelters. So in this case, smelters. The blue bars are the CRU data set, and the red or orangey red data set is the entity disclosures. So a reasonably good match for the smelting activity, and we thought this is a really good toolkit to have in the toolbox when you have gaps in disclosures. It provides asset level data which can be aggregated together to fill gaps where there are gaps in disclosures, at least in the short term, and it allows for benchmarking of ASI's entities for within each supply chain, for instance, smelting, alumina refining, and so forth. All right, so just to kind of illustrate some of those challenges around disclosures, and we understand that and acknowledge that a lot of those disclosures are targeting different purposes and audiences. The schematic here is just trying to illustrate some of the challenges. So, for an example, you might have an entity that's involved in a number of different supply chain activities, from bauxite mining, alumina refining, and smelting, and you might have multiple facilities. A subset of those might be ASI certified, and some of the challenges we're seeing is that there's a good level, sometimes really good level of disclosure for the entire corporate, but not necessarily matching up with the certification scope. So that's an area of improvement for some entities. In terms of the ability to benchmark performance within that entity, or that entity for a particular activity, let's say alumina refining, with the industry benchmark, there's some challenges around that also, if that level of data isn't provided by the entity in their disclosures. So asset or activity level disclosures would be really useful going forward as a kind of a best practice. But in the meantime, the CRU and other emissions tools like it can be used to build data sets to be able to do that work, to do benchmarking and tracking over time. So just in the section about data disclosures, just some of the recommendations we provided were, to encourage more standardized disclosures by ASI entities, and that will help enhance transparency, will help enable benchmarking going forward. And providing guidelines of minimum levels of data disclosure would be really helpful. For instance, not only total emissions, but also intensity of emissions to allow that benchmarking per tonne of product. Correlating those disclosures to the scope of certification would be, really important, I think, going forward. And, in the absence of that, providing asset level disclosures would enable that as well. Right, just moving quickly on to emissions and energy profiles. So this is looking at the disclosures collected from the ASI entities and how they look across the different supply chains. And we'll start with energy here. So this is the energy profile, and we've got a box plot on the right-hand side, which sort of maps out the distribution, maximum, minimum within each supply chain activity. So that's the activities are on the vertical axis, energy intensities on the horizontal, and you can see the spread here and the spread of the different activities, right? So you can quite quickly see that. I might just add also that the spread and the positioning of the energy intensity of each activity, it is related intrinsically to the demand, the activity, the demand for the activities within each process. So, for example, smelting. What you're doing there is you're breaking the strong aluminium and oxygen bond in aluminium oxide or alumina to create that primary aluminium, and that requires a whole lot of energy, electrical energy, to be able to do that. And hence, you see the gigajoules per ton for smelting being up there. With alumina refining, there's a lot of thermal energy demand to be able to digest the bauxite ore, to extract the aluminium oxide components of that ore, and then to calcine that alumina to the point of being able to smelt it. And so, that's reflected here. There's a bit of variation for different types of ores and different processes for that alumina refining. And then you've got the remelting, recycling to downstream processes and downstream at a lower level of intensity, relating to remelting of scrap and then casting, forming aluminium products. Bauxite mining, there was one data point that wasn't really valid, and that was relating to, we don't expect a high level of energy intensity there. Right, so that's energy. Moving on to emissions profile. Again, similar to the energy figure before, we've got the different activities on the y-axis, and on the horizontal axis, we've got Scope 1, Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions in terms of tons of CO2 per ton of product. And keeping in mind the product is different for each of these activities. But looking at this, again, smelting is an area of focus for the entire aluminium sector, because it comprises the highest emissions per ton of product. Overall, there is a massive range, however, of variation from about 1.3 to 14 tonnes per tonne. This is within the ASI cohort. That variation is really driven by the source of electricity going into that energy intensive process, whether it's low carbon, hydro, renewables or nuclear, whether it's gas or whether it's coal on the higher end. The majority of the ASI cohort of smelters are below the current target that ASI set in the original standards. So that's 8 tonne per tonne. There's one above. And compared to smelting, the other activities are a lot lower in terms of energy demand, but also narrower because there's less diversity in terms of the energy mix employed. So drilling down a little bit deeper into smelting and the individual entities within ASI, this graph here, similar to the one that we saw with the CRU comparison, this graph here is showing the entity disclosures over time. So we've got up to 5 years data here, and each of these individual bars refer to a different year of disclosed data. And on the vertical axis, we've got different entities in different regions of the world. And this is for smelters. So this is an example whereby you want to benchmark smelters, but you need a apples for apples comparison to be able to do that. And so what we're seeing here is 3 sort of loose groups of distribution across the ASI cohort. Sorry, my slides are skipping a little bit, but three distributions of of emissions performance, you could say. You've got the lower cohort, which are the ones using renewable energy or low carbon nuclear or hydro. You've got a couple of entities, smelting entities using gas, so they're around the 8 tonne per tonne target that ASI have set. And you've got one entity in the high end utilising currently coal in its energy mix. So this is the picture for in terms of disclosures by ASI entities, but how does that compare to the global picture? Well, you can build that again. See, I use an example where you can take a look at a global cohort of smelters. It's the same graph as before, but or similar graph as before, but rotated 90 degrees. So you've got carbon intensity, scope 1, scope 2 on the left-hand side, the vertical axis, and on the bottom axis you've got cumulative global production per year. So this is the total global cohort of smelting production, and again you see the same distribution by the source of the energy going to those smelters being the greatest driver of the sort of the emissions intensity for smelting. So hydro, nuclear, renewables down on the low end here, gas in the middle, and coal-dominated energy mixes on the high end here. I mean, what is really interesting to see is that the majority of ASI certified smelters are on the low end, and there is one on the above the target currently, but that represents, in this cohort, 50% of production, of global production currently is using this coal-dominated energy mix, as you can see from this cohort here. And if you sort of compare where the industry currently is to where it needs to be, there is an estimate from the International Aluminium Institute as to, if we are to meet the Paris goals by 2050, sorry, we're skipping again. What we need from primary aluminium is a carbon intensity of 2 to 3 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of aluminium by 2050, and that number there is not just for smelting, which is shown here on the graph, but it's cradle to gate. So it's bauxite refining, bauxite mining, alumina refining, aluminium smelting, and it includes not only scope 1 and 2, but elements of scope 3 as well. So you can see the scale of challenge required for the entire industry. So in terms of what's needed to be able to shift the sector to those Paris goals by 2050, we need significant reduction in carbon footprint across the industry, but for smelting particularly, we need the entire global cohort and any new production to be rapidly shifting down to that bottom end of the emissions curve. So in terms of ASI's role in this, obviously from the highlighted smelters that you can see here, not many of them are in this high cohort. If there are avenues for engagement or for certification, alternative pathways for those smelters in this cohort to shift them down, that could be one way to increase ASI's impact. You still require significant time-bound reductions to be demonstrated over time, but we won't be able to globally achieve those goals unless everyone is able to get there. So just some concluding remarks. Clearly some of those pictures there illustrate the unprecedented scale of reductions in emissions required across the entire aluminium sector by all supply chain activities to meet those 2050 climate goals. The ASI cohort of entities is a subset of that, and if ASI can help that transition down, whatever it can do is going to help in the greater picture. Ultimately, looking at those disclosures, ASI is supporting industry change. It's helping improve the transparency, accountability, and assurance of those disclosures. There's some new I think some new things coming into the Bayliss performance standards that will support that, and through the last couple of years, we've seen those positive trends of improving quality of disclosures and members taking up disclosures where they weren't doing them previously. So some really positive trends there. There are some challenges around harmonizing those disclosures, particularly for benchmarking purposes, and a number of recommendations for that going forward. So I think in a nutshell, that's really a high-level overview of that piece of work over the last couple of years. Really happy to have some discussion around this, Chris, and also to take questions from our audience.
And there's a lot. Thanks very much, David. That's fantastic, and thanks for being. There's a lot of material in there, right? In quite a brief time, and maybe to reiterate that the report is actually available on the ASI website, so people should go and explore and have a look at the data itself. We've got a whole heap of questions. I see them they're in two buckets, really. One, I think, is a bucket of questions for me rather than you. But I'd rather take the time that we have with you to answer some specifics about the report, and if we can get onto those other ones, we will. Interesting question early on is about your definitions of the kind of disclosure quality and what it means to be good, medium, or poor. And can you give some some threshold values or way that you put entities into those buckets?
Yeah, so we've got some supporting slides, luckily, that I can dig out from my my backpack. Really, it was a really qualitative. There's I'm not aware of some standards around that, but so in the absence of that, we took a qualitative approach of the ASI performance standard, I think 5.1, requires disclosures of energy and emissions, and so these were the sort of qualitative ratings we took. So good as the entity disclosed energy and emissions, both total values but also intensities, and production was part of that to be able to do those conversions. So good was supplying all of that. Medium is where energy and emissions were both reported, but sometimes only total, sometimes only intensities. Poor levels of disclosure would be whereby you might have emissions disclosed, but maybe not energy, and no disclosure is just nothing, or not within the scope of certification. So that's really, in a nutshell, that's it.
Great. Thank you. Look, and I note in there that the scopes, and there's a lot of questions coming on scope. We'll maybe touch a bit on that in a moment, but is to say that, I guess, from this corporate accounting perspective, from what you are looking at, but also CRU, it's the traditional kind of scope 1, scope 2 that forms the bulk of that. And indeed, that's the threshold values for smelters in our existing version 2 performance standard at the moment, 8 tons per ton.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah, it's around the scopes there, we did try, and I'll just pop back to this slide here, but we did try and collect scope 3 data disclosures as well, and there were a number of entities that were beginning to veer into disclosure of scope 3. There's some challenges around that as well. What categories of scope 3 are they disclosing, and that differs from one entity to another. And so in terms of our work for the past couple of years in trying to build a profile of how do ASI, what is the profile of ASI entities, you couldn't, there's not enough entities disclosing scope 3 to be able to build a comparable profile that you can benchmark, that you can compare and build a profile like we showed in that box plot graph there. So scope 1 and scope 2 were the only kind of reasonable basis by which we could do some comparisons. Otherwise, you'd have a handful of entities to look at.
And even then, I mean, you mentioned this with the activity levels, right? We've got a question on what are these different scopes, and I think it's worthwhile just spending a couple of minutes on that. The scope language is a corporate accounting language, right? It comes from the GHG protocol, and it says something about your ownership of emissions. So scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions from the entities that you're, the assets that you kind of control. Scope 2 is the energy related emissions, the emissions related to the energy that you import to that site. So electricity or heat and steam that you buy from other sources. But note that for smelters, a grid connected smelter, the electricity is scope 2. But for a captive power plant, and we see it in the data set there, that's a scope 1. So it's very difficult to compare some of these different scopes to benchmark across processes. For those who don't know, scope 3 is basically everything else in the value chain, up and downstream of that entity. And so for entities that have integrated, let's say, bauxite, alumina, aluminium, they would have a lot of scope 1s and scope 2s because they don't have anything upstream of them. But those who are purchasing alumina, that alumina would be in their scope 3. So a way I like to think of it is that scope 1, the scope language, is about your performance as an entity over time. It's about you comparing yourself in the future to yourself today or yourself in the past. But it's not so good at comparing across space, where a product footprinting approach is more appropriate. So there you don't get this kind of double counting, and you can say a ton of aluminium on the market compared to another ton of aluminium on the market. What's the carbon footprint there? So these are the challenges, and you expressed it very well, David, when saying that these different data is used for different purposes. And really what we're looking for here is that disclosure talks about the methods you use to get that final number, and the data that populates those different buckets, whether they're scopes or sources or product level accounting, is similar data.
Yes, and the underlying data is the same. And yeah, exactly.
So there was a question actually come in as well on that, which is this recommendation about disclosure by source, so by energy source, and can we be clearer in the guidance there? Maybe your take on what you mean by source, and then maybe I'll give my take on what's meant by source as well.
Yeah, so I think there might be a slide somewhere in there around source. So source can be direct emissions. So let's take smelting for an example. You can have emissions from the direct from the process itself. You can also have emissions from the electricity. I think we were talking about, I'm probably digressing, we're talking about energy, aren't we? And so you can have, in terms of the smelting process, the majority of the energy use in that smelter is electrical energy. To do that electrochemical reduction of splitting aluminium and oxygen atoms apart. But there's all sorts of ancillary processes in the smelter. There's the production of carbon anodes. That's got a energy source that might not be electricity. There's the cast house itself. Again, that could be different as well. So being able to look at those different sources and being transparent and disclosing that level of data would be ideal. But there's other sort of energy components as well. I think Chris, feel free to jump in. I think
No, this is my experience with this as well. Is right. If you just say to someone, "What's your energetic? What's the energetic input to this?" and someone gives you a gigajoules number, it's impossible to compare, right? If you have an electricity component in there, it's a thermal piece that's been converted to gigajoules, compared to, let's say, a hydro-powered electricity piece that's converted to gigajoules, and then you roll in your thermal alumina processes into that as well. Picking that apart is near impossible. So actually having this disclosure by energy carrier almost per activity allows you to build up a picture of the entity rather than have to break down the entity into its various component parts, which is very difficult from a singular number. So increased granularity, that's difficult because it has an increased burden on the reporting company. But to be honest, the questions that are asked over a single gigajoule number are much greater than the time you might spend reporting or disclosing some of those numbers. And I think people should watch out in the new version of the guidance, or the new version of the standard, which goes to public consultation in January. We are picking through that. So we are looking through those pieces. And I've got to say, we're going to refer a lot of times to the International Aluminium Institute, who do collect and report that data in that form. So by energy carrier, by activity. And it does allow us to roll up at entity level all these different elements. We have so Margie's asked a question about, it's actually about the standard, but maybe we can inject it in here as well. Is how will the new standard be able to be compared with some of these tools? Because the new standard is going to include some of those scope 3 elements. So in the future, do you think that the CRU type databases will have to tack on scope 3, or do you think it's up to entities themselves to publicly disclose that?
Yeah, I'm not a I don't know the ins and outs of the CRU tool itself, but I believe and best to refer to CRU, but I haven't. I believe they are if they either include or are looking at Scope 3 emissions. Or components of it, but I might be wrong, so I can't comment on CRU. But yeah, it is going to be a challenge as the standard evolves and improves. Hopefully, what we're looking at will hopefully improve over time. But and backdating that, or being able to. Yeah, I think it's still going to be valid to look at Scope 1 and 2, but I think progressively we'll be able to start looking at Scope 1, 2, and 3 and see how those compare over time.
Do you see? I mean, it's early days. I guess you said that some companies are starting to do that Scope 3. When they are reported, do you see some kind of quality coming through, or is it just a kind of Scope 3 number that's put out there and it's kind of it's nice to have it, but it's non-comparable between some of these different entities?
I think it's a variable. Sometimes it's just a number, but sometimes it's well qualified as to what it actually represents. So that's great. But having some more standardization around it would be would be ideal.
It's in the upcoming revision, and it's yet to be gone through the process, but in public consultation, people will see this in January. The 8 tons per ton threshold value, Scope 1 and 2 for smelting at the moment will shift, and it will actually incorporate, we hope, Scope 3 upstream of the smelter. So it will include alumina refining, it will include the energy related emissions, the sodium hydroxide going into refineries before it comes into the smelter. That's kind of it's equivalent to Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 categories 1, 3, and 4 for those who are interested in categorization of Scope 3. In fact, I would urge people to go and look at the GHG protocol. It's quite clearly defined, these different categories, these different Scope 3 buckets. Take Margie's point, right now the pressure is on 1 and 2, but I think increasingly the discussion is around incorporating those broader scopes as well. We certainly feel it, and certainly we're beginning to articulate that in new versions of the standard. David, this quality of disclosure is one thing, but also performance of facilities is another, and performance over time. And there's some changes year on year, right, that we could begin to pick through. Are they meaningful changes, or is that just noise given the significant impact on emissions by, let's say, electricity source?
Yeah, so there's for those who've been able to read through the report and or want to delve into the report, there is a section there around looking at were there observable trends in emissions or energy use over time, and on the whole, there are improvements in some, others are static, others have had little blips, and there is year on year external factors as well. We've had COVID-19 that's thrown a lot of spanners in the works of everyone's plans, and you've had probably production facilities who've wanted to maintain production, but perhaps didn't have the demand, so had to reduce production, and then their energy use per ton obviously gets impacted. As to the question, is it noise? Is it something that is? I think it's going to take a longer time. I think what we did in this piece of work was to look at are there any trends in the last 3 to 5 years? But I think a more valid analysis might be to look at how entities are performing based on their targets, and are they meeting those trajectory targets, and also where their baseline is, and acknowledge that every entity has their own baseline year that they start with. So it's a little bit a bit more complex than just saying year on year. What we need is sustained and long-term trends to where we need to be. It doesn't matter year on year so much, just in the long term.
And that's I think that's beginning to be articulated as well in the new version of the standards too. I watch this space, people, but it is about this forward looking, not just about the legacy of the last couple of years. It's come through in some of the questions too, right? It is that ASI is aligning itself with a 1.5 degree sort of trajectory for the sector. That doesn't yet exist, but people IAI are publishing something next week on that. So a beyond 2 degree scenario exists, as you said, David mentioned that today. 1.5 is coming. So we're going to know what that kind of slope is going to look like in the future, and we're going to reference it. But also we need to capture the emissions, not capture them for the atmosphere. We need to capture those within the membership and then drive change, right? So of the 1.1 billion tons emitted by the sector today, ASI membership represents less than 10%. So are we going to change the performance of that 10% of emissions, or do we want to drive change in the broader emissions profile? And I think Johan's asked a very pertinent question there, which is the ASI certification actually driving those reductions, or is it just best-in-class companies more likely to adopt the ASI standards? Johan, I think it's the latter historically, but what we want to do is, as David said, drive performance towards a 2050 1.5 degree pathway, which is essentially net zero, which is, you know.
Yeah, and mindful also that the ASI certification is not just about greenhouse gas emissions. I know this is the topic we're talking about tonight, but it's around the other aspects of sustainability and social performance. So
absolutely,
there's also a bigger picture.
You know, the most questions I get, David, at the moment, I think probably comes from financial institutions. You know, historically, ASI, the pull has been from the market. So you see some people wanting, let's say, low carbon or responsibly sourced to market. But actually, the big questions we're getting at the moment are from banks and lenders, because they're getting ready to realize this decarbonisation that needs to happen, these 1.1 billion tons of aluminium sector emissions that needs to be got rid of. And that means retooling the industry as a whole. It means trillions of dollars of capital. And when banks begin to fund that, they'll want to know what performance is in other areas too. So it's a really neat way. The GHG is the question being asked a lot, but I think it's a neat way in for us to address broad ESG issues, because yes, decarbonisation is also going to have impact on local communities. It's also going to have impacts on biodiversity depending on the energy source as well. So I really like that. That way in is GHG, but it's much broader than that, as you say. We have a lot of technology questions. And we're not going to get through to all those in 3 minutes. Maybe David is to I guess to note. Well, it's to ask you, what are your key messages to our audience today in terms of corporate disclosure, public disclosure, but what ASI needs to do in order to affect change in the future? Maybe put you on the spot a bit there, but
yeah, I think it's ultimately supporting, encouraging change in the industry, in improving. It's obviously ASI won't be responsible for the technology changes that are absolutely required across the entire industry. That greater disclosures is not going to alone is not going to drive that. However, greater disclosures and transparency and accountability and tracking to those goals, that is where I see, or we see, as one of ASI's roles in encouraging that trajectory. But it comes with, as you say, not just with disclosures, but with massive technology changes, also changes in finance and in terms of investment and how banks lend, but also in terms of consumer behavior. And part of that, bringing that back is improving recycling, and that's consumer behavior as well. I know we're getting close to time, so
no. But also, this is neat, because the questions were asked about product level accounting too. So those products meeting the market, David. Maybe we'll have another chat another time about that, because for people's information in the chain of custody guidance, that is being explored under 9.8. So that real kind of cradle to gate life cycle product carbon footprinting perspective is covered, albeit voluntarily, in the COC standard as a whole. Brilliant. Thank you very much, David, and also to Ronny and Nursiani, who have been in the background there, ready to pounce and answer questions if required. And thank you as well for the report. I know that you will present to our standards committee next week as well and answer further questions. And I'm sure welcome questions from people by email, and your email's on the screen there. So thank you very much to Atmolite for the presentation and for participating today, and for excellent report. Just to note, webinar participants, we have another 45 minutes on, which will be held next month, date to be confirmed, and that's on our public dashboard, which has been recently released and gives the public access to information on certification per criteria, by entity, by country. You can split the data up lots of different ways. You can download it in CSV format. So it's a really rich database, and we will be presenting, not me, but my colleagues will be presenting from the Secretariat on the power of that tool and where you can go to access that. So keep your eyes peeled for announcements on that. It really feeds into the public disclosure transparency discussion that we've been having today. Really rich database. So with that, thank you very much once again to David and colleagues, and thank you all for your excellent and many questions. I'm always available to answer them anytime as well, so feel free to email away. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.